Building design maturity is rarely about a breakthrough moment. More often it's an accumulation of hundreds of conversations, building relationship, pieces of evidence, small acts of perseverance and resilience. The organisations we look at today, like Gov.uk or Singapore or Ireland, they didn't get there overnight. They have got there because people kept showing up, kept making the case, and kept demonstrating the value of design. Our job, as we see it, is simply to keep the conversation moving forward. And then I suppose share tips for people to be how to be resilient in an environment which maybe isn't design mature. That's something that we have learnt over many hard years. And then I'll talk about the payoffs, which is what Demo was referencing. Okay, so usually when I like to do a workshop or a presentation, I start with an icebreaker about tell me something about you that you don't know by looking at you, which I think is a great one. My answer to that is always, I am Kaiser Soze. Now, unfortunately, I have about 50 minutes worth of material to talk about, so I can't go into the story. If we have time later on, I'll come back to that, about why I am Kaiser Soze. Okay, so let's talk about my journey into design. Once I left education, my education was arts background, as in history, and I had studied economics and accountancy. I have no design background whatsoever. I didn't go to art college, I have none of that. These were my jobs before I joined the civil service at the age of 25. It's quite an impressive CV. I was the head of transport for Curly's Supermarket. I was the director of masonry logistics for Atchison Glovers, who are a brick firm, and I was a chief fungal quality officer for Accuses Mushrooms. Very impressive CV, but in reality, this is what I was, okay? So, the thing about these jobs is, although they are traditional factory-based work, it gave me an opportunity to understand how people live and work on a day-to-day basis, which is probably where I generated my interest into design, because I was always asking questions about how people interacted within the systems within their work. So when I look back now, that was a great grounding base for me. And then when I joined the civil service, over the years I've worked in major transformations within the Department for Communities. Programs including child support reforms, welfare reforms, and the introduction of universal credit. All big items that impact everybody across society in one way or another. Okay. Looking back, throughout my time in those teams, I probably showed many of the traits of being a designer before I actually had the job title. Okay, so I was in there as project officers, etc., etc. I always asked awkward questions. I always challenged assumptions. I frustrated people that I was working with by refusing to accept that things had to be done in a certain way. And at times I was seen as someone who slowed things down rather than help move things forward. Okay. But what I've come to realise is that curiosity and constructive challenge are at the heart of good design. And everybody in this room will have those traits as well. More importantly, I had the privilege of working with many dedicated, talented and open-minded civil servants who taught me an enormous amount. They helped me understand policy, operation, delivery and the realistics of working in the complex public sector environment. And that experience is what has shaped me as a service designer and given me an appreciation of the wider NICS public sector system that I use and draw on every day. In 2019, I joined the Innovation Lab as a service designer and was sent to, this is Service Design Doing Executive School in Amsterdam. And that for me is when the penny dropped. That's when, listening to the facilitators and the designers in the room and the practitioners talk about user research, journey map and prototype and systems thinking, that's when I realised that the discipline was built around the very things that I had instinctively been trying to do throughout my career. And I remember thinking, all this isn't new to me, it's just finally got a name. That was the penny drop moment for me. I often reflect that the time spent in the first 20 years of my career, it was frustrating, but I have now discovered the tools that were going to help me maybe change the system. Okay, so that's just a wee bit about my background. This is a Venn diagram that I use when I'm presenting to civil servants about what service design in government is. Part of my job in the Innovation Lab was to try and build capability and spread the word of design thinking, service design, call it whatever you will. But service design in government is all about making sure that the public services and policies work for the people who use them. And in this room, that's all of us. Every single one of us is impacted by something that the public sector does day and daily. And while we're doing that, we're also meeting the needs of government priorities and business needs. And it's both, for me, service design in government is both a mindset and a set of practical tools that can help us understand people's real experiences. And we do this by observing, listening and engaging with citizens, stakeholders and staff to understand what's working well and where the pain points and problems are. And Michael talked before about using observation in the research tools. That's kind of what we do. That's where we start. Okay. So you'll notice here that service design is in the sweet spot here. Service design is trying to strike the balance between citizen and stakeholder needs, business needs, and policy government minister needs, basically, is what that is. Okay? Whoops.
Okay.
Bing. You nearly got me. Okay, so this is our Bible. This is the book that we adhere to and refer to all the time. It was written by a lady called Lou Down, who was the head of digital design for government design services from about 2014 to about 2019. Okay, I'm going to give Dima a copy of this so it'll be in the library if anybody wants to read it. Lou and her team set out to conduct a study of what the UK government delivered. This was done in 2014. At that time, 80% of the cost of government was spent on delivering services. I think there was something like over 2,500 individual services that they identified through this, and they hadn't captured them all. Okay? But of that 80%, 60% was service failure, basically. So people time spent in dealing with complaints, time spent dealing with dead ends. For us, by redesigning services around user needs, Gov.uk helped make government services easier to access and reduce unnecessary demand. The lesson is that good design isn't just about improving experiences, it's about delivering better, more efficient public services. And that's what the guys and myself have been trying to do internally within the NICS. I'm going to move on now after our talk on this slide about where Northern Ireland is in its journey. But people asked for a good example of where a government is actually delivering design. Believe it or not, the UK government actually is that. Even though on the news you hear so much negativity around government services and policies, they are world leaders in digital design and delivering services across the globe. So many other countries are trying to follow their example. Okay, so I've put up a couple of links to websites. Recently, the UK government have actually introduced a test and learn chapter in their Magenta book. The Magenta book is the gospel as far as government is concerned about how things are delivered. That is an incredible step for design that is in there. And it just shows the impact that design is having within the government circles. The design note blog is staff internally within the UK government talking about case studies and examples. It's really great if you want to go in and look through it, search through it for individual examples of where design is actually working to deliver day-to-day services for human beings. There are over 5,000 designers working within the UK government. In this room, you have 50% of the service designers in the Northern Ireland Civil Service, if the other two guys want to put their hands up. That is the difference you're talking about. Okay. So, moving on, what value can service design and government deliver? I'm not going to go into this in too much detail. You can look through them all yourself. Touching on just a couple of these value streams. Reducing risk. Design, we all know this, reduces risk, and it comes from testing ideas early and validating assumptions and learning before significant investment is made. In government, data-informed decision-making is something that should be happening more often, and that would ensure priorities and solutions are shaped by evidence. You know, alongside benefits such as greater efficiency, innovation, collaboration, public trust, these streams demonstrate how design can help our public sector organisations deliver better outcomes for both the citizen and government. Okay? Ultimately, service design isn't just about improving services, it's about creating the condition for better decisions to be made, for better investments to be made, and for better outcomes over the long term for all of us in this room. Okay? So, I put this up just to give you an idea of what the landscape is like in relation to design in Northern Ireland compared to what it's like across the rest of the British Isles. And you can see already from the slide, the only part of the British Isles that don't have service standards or design principles is Northern Ireland. Okay? Every other government and administration across the islands have published design standards to guide the development of public services. Those standards help create consistency, build capability, and establish a shared understanding of what good looks like. The absence of these in Northern Ireland is a challenge that we face day and daily, but it also presents us with an opportunity to try and shape our own design principles and learn from the people that have already led the way. If design standards help turn good design into organisational practice, then developing our own could be an important step in maturing design capability across the NICS. Talking about design maturity, I don't know if anybody has seen this before. This is a take on the Danish design ladder. The Danish design ladder was introduced by the Danish Design Centre as a simple way of understanding design maturity within organisations. My view is that Northern Ireland public sector currently sits around level 2, which is design as styling. And it doesn't mean that design isn't happening. It just means that design is often brought in after key decisions have been made, and it's focusing on things like communication, making it look good, interfaces and service experiences after they've already set it up, rather than shaping the whole service itself from the start. The encouraging part is these arrows. So across the NICS, there have been examples of teams moving into this level 3, where user research, testing and iteration are helping shape decisions much earlier. I'll talk about a few examples towards the end. By comparison, the UK government is at level 3, moving into level 4. They are strategic, they are using it as a strategic competence to influence policy and service delivery. The opportunity for us as public sector designers is to make that shift from level 2 to level 3 the norm rather than the exception. So when design moves upstream in this model, it becomes less about outputs and more about reducing risk, improving outcomes, and delivering better public services. Of course, there's challenges in making that transition. I'd like to touch a few of those in the next slide. I'm not going to go through all these individually, but if our ambition is to move from design as styling to design as process, the question becomes what's getting in the way. These are getting in the way. These are our lived experience as public sector service designers. This is what we live day to day. This is what we face. So over the years, we've encountered these, and these barriers aren't Northern Ireland specific. Other organisations and public sector bodies have faced these over the years. And in my experience, these challenges tend to fall into 3 themes. So they're either structural, cultural, or system constraints. Okay? So for the structural constraints, you have things like budget. Everybody's aware of the budget pressures within Northern Ireland at the minute. There's no agreed budget. That impacts internally on the ability for us to do any work at all, because senior leaders within the civil service, they have to prioritise where they're spending their money. We all want results. We want results now. For us to try and get design done where it's in at the start, it's difficult for people to take the risk to make the decision, to do the user research, to identify the right problem before solving it, because of the pressures of not having enough budget. Another one is the procurement process. It's often designed for certainty and predefined solutions, whereas design thrives on discovery and iteration. Finally, in this section of structural ones, we have legacy systems, which is the old computer systems, and the civil service is littered with these. The civil service is littered with these. You could come up with a brilliant idea as part of a design solution for a product, but because of you're dealing with a 20-year-old system, you can't put it in. It doesn't have the capability to deliver it. That's a common thing that we find when we're working with different teams across the public sector. But together, these cultural factors can mean that design is invited to improve decisions after they've already been made, rather than help shaping them from the start. When we look at the cultural constraints, we're looking at things like risk aversion. Risk aversion and silo working are so prevalent in the public sector. You hear about it on the news, and I'm sure that you've heard about these things from time to time. But we encounter risk aversion, which is understandable because people are spending public money and there's accountability involved in all of this. But it makes experimentation feel uncomfortable. It's not something people are comfortable with. Siloed working is where departments and professions optimise their own part of a system, but they forget that citizens experience the whole journey. So they're only focused on their own area. And then there's a lack of design literacy across the public sector. People don't understand design. We have developed a 2-day design training course for civil servants, and it is delivered. We've delivered it to 6 or 7 different business areas to date. But it's not getting the traction. Well, I'll come to the advocacy bit in a wee minute, but unless we have senior leaders who are advocating for design, it's not going to happen in the current system within NICS. And again, we have thirdly, we have the system constraints. So the system constraints, include things like political change. We all live that day to day. We're getting closer to an election. We can see what's going on with different shifting political views. You also have the fact that ministries change, and with ministries changing, political direction changes, and that impacts where you would want to design stuff for citizens rather than for what people think people want. There's capacity constraints where teams are stretched, delivering today's work, leaving little room to explore tomorrow's opportunities. And finally, looking at metrics and targets. The public sector often measures what's easiest to count rather than what matters the most to citizens. When that happens, focus drifts towards outputs rather than outcomes. Okay. This is just the experience that I have lived and the guys have lived, and I'm just sharing it so that you guys, we're sort of lifting the lid here on what goes on behind the scenes. It's like the Wizard of Oz moment. We're delivering services for everyone in this room. And I think it's important that you get to see this and that we do talk about it, but it's difficult, and it's why I framed the talk around resilience. When you look at all of these, they're not really design problems, right? They're system challenges, and design helps us expose these and understand them and can help us navigate them, okay? Looking across the barriers, one thing's clear. It's not that we lack talented and committed public servants. What we lack are the conditions to allow design to influence decisions early enough, often enough, and at the scale required. The encouraging thing is that every public sector organisation like UK, like Ireland, like Estonia, all these world leaders, they have come through this journey. They have faced these same challenges, Their success came not from eliminating these constraints, but from recognising them and addressing them, and deliberately and steadily building design into the way decisions are made. And for me, that's the opportunity facing Northern Ireland. And the question is not about whether we have the ability to do this, but it's whether we can create the conditions for the capability to flourish. Okay? So, Dima asked me to leave a few tips for people. So these are the tips, hopefully, that you can take away. You're already doing the first one. Find your tribe. So, again, I'm speaking on behalf of the 3 of us here at the minute, and in fact Cormac as well. So We have set up a public sector, Northern Ireland-wide public sector design community, similar to what DEMA has done here with the design community. We meet once a month in a shared space, in a safe space, just to talk about the problems that we have, that we come up with, talk about different ways of solving those problems. But design can feel surprisingly lonely. When I was working in those teams in welfare, in universal credit and child support, I felt isolated because I was the one challenging the system. At that stage, I didn't have a tribe. I didn't have people that I could rely on. So it can be lonely, and I'm sure out there in different organisations that you guys are all working in, you might be the only person that understands design in your company. So reach out and try and find people who are in a similar position to you, and maybe similar companies somewhere. Meet up for a coffee, set up your own little tribe somewhere, bounce things off one another. Honestly, it's the best thing that we have done. You know, Vic talked at the last chat about her being the only designer in a startup and how she felt it was challenging talking to people who don't understand design. Get out there, do what you're doing here now, build your networks, but set up your little tribe so that you can feel psychologically safe to discuss the problems that you're dealing with, because communities matter. And you know, we have found in the public sector that we have a community now of over 100 members, and I can pick up the phone and speak to somebody in Belfast City Council about a topic I'm working on. I can phone up and pick somebody in the ambulance service. You know, we use a Teams network, so people can just drop in queries and questions all the time. It's great having that sense of community. The second one that I'll talk to is be a translator. Within the public sector, the language of design is contrary to the language that's used within the public sector. It just doesn't align. It's like speaking French in a Japanese restaurant in Japan. It doesn't really work, right? So most organisations aren't thinking about journey maps. They're not thinking about service blueprints or double diamonds. They're thinking about risks, budgets, performance, compliance and outcomes. And one of our most important jobs as service designers is translating design into the language that the organisation already understands. The message lands much more effectively when people see design as a way to reduce risk, improve decision making and deliver better results. So if you can, yes, we have our own language. To use a blueprint terminology, we use that backstage, but when you're talking to the clients, use their language front stage, okay? Stay curious, but don't be defensive. So again, these are all learned from many difficult conversations that we've had across the public sector. When people challenge design, as we have experienced, we need to resist the instinct to defend the process. We have learnt that. Originally, we would have gone, no, design, and we were trying to almost force it down people's necks. That didn't work. Okay, so try and resist that temptation. Yes, our method works. Yes, we believe in the method, but we have learnt, again, it's part of this translation thing, that we can't get defensive when people query it, because more often than not, they're expressing genuine concern about risk, delivery, cost or accountability. Okay, you need to put yourself in their shoes. We needed to empathise with them about why they were challenging what we were suggesting. Understanding their concerns is usually a far more productive thing than trying to win an argument in the long run. Okay, next one then is lead with evidence. The strongest voice in the room shouldn't be the loudest voice. The strongest voice in the room for us should be the user's voice or the citizen's voice when it comes to public services. Research, data, real experiences are often far more persuasive than opinion. So I was presenting to a board after I'd done some research and was presenting to a board my findings. I was challenged about those findings by a senior executive. I was able to take a quote, word for word quote from a customer and put it in front of the rest of the board and said, I'm not saying this, your customers are saying this. The direction of the conversation changed. Okay, use real evidence. Quotes are incredibly powerful, or they are in the public sector especially, because sometimes senior executives in the public sector aren't exposed to citizens. They're kept back from them. So lead with evidence, let it do the heavy lifting. Next one then, I've talked about this already. Find a sponsor or an advocate if you can. It's difficult. It's probably the one thing that we have probably struggled with the most in the public sector. We haven't really got that senior sponsor at the top of the pyramid that advocates constantly for design. But we have found them in the lower levels. So there was a great example on a project that Tony worked with Advanced Care, with a lady called Karina Grimes. She was incredible. She got it. She drove her product team forward using it. She supported, she constantly advocates for design now. She uses it in her day-to-day practice. She's gone on to great things in the NHS in the UK, and actually I think has set up her own private company now, using design methods as a way of working day-to-day. But if you, within your organisation, try and find that senior sponsor that can advocate, because they have a seat at the table that you may not have. Okay. Finally, on the tips is believe in the method. Okay. There will always be moments when progress feels slow, and when there's a temptation to maybe skip a bit of research or shorten the discovery or jump straight to solutions. Actually, this happened to us today. We were talking about this today. My advice and what we have learned, you need to hold your nerve here. Okay. Understanding needs, testing assumptions, and learning before acting remains one of the most reliable ways to improve services and reduce uncertainty. So hold your nerve. I suppose if there's one overall thing I've learnt in this, it's building design maturity is rarely about a breakthrough moment. More often it's an accumulation of hundreds of conversations, building relationship, pieces of evidence, small acts of perseverance and resilience. The organisations we look at today, like Gov.uk or Singapore or Ireland, they didn't get there overnight. They have got there because people kept showing up, kept making the case, and kept demonstrating the value of design. Our job, as we see it, is simply to keep the conversation moving forward. As a public sector designer, I experience imposter syndrome massively. At the minute, I am standing here totally overwhelmed with imposter syndrome. I often find myself surrounded by experts and wondering whether I belong in the room. But I have learnt that my role isn't to be the expert in everything. Okay? As a designer, my role is to bring curiosity, to bring empathy, and to bring evidence into conversations, helping others to ask better questions and make better decisions. So if you're feeling like an imposter, you're probably exactly where you need to be. You're learning, you're challenging assumptions, and you're helping create change. Trust in the process, trust the evidence, and trust the value you bring, even when you're the only designer in the room. Okay? So, Dima touched on this, not take too long on these. What's the payoff? So, here I just pulled together an example of some of the things that I have worked on and Tony and James have worked on. I'll just let you look at these yourselves. So, looking at that slide, it just reminds me how privileged we are as public sector designers. Very few professions give you the opportunity to work across such a wide range of challenges, from healthcare and justice to digital inclusion, sustainability, economic development. Every project is different, but each offers the chance to create meaningful impact for citizens, communities, and society as a whole. And that's what makes our job so rewarding. Okay, couple of quick examples. So the redundancy payment service, which was totally manual process, went live in May this year. These are all the different artifacts that we had pulled together as part of that process. You'll see journey maps there, there's blueprints here, there's thoughts and observations, there's how might we questions, There is a low fidelity prototype of the actual system sitting there as well. So, you know, what that project why it was particularly meaningful was the context of it. You know, people are accessing this service are often dealing with uncertainty, financial pressures, and significant life change. They have just lost their job, their livelihood. They're worried about their mortgage. They're worried about where their next meal is coming from. These guys were making them fill out a 20-page form, asking them questions in technical language that they didn't understand. Okay? By redesigning this service around the needs of those people, we were able to simplify this process, remove unnecessary cognitive burden, and make it easier for people to get the support that they're entitled to at a very difficult time in their lives. So we actually removed the application form and made the insolvency practitioner send all the information to the person who had been made redundant and just ask them if it was right or not. It's as simple as that. They just have to tick a box to say, yes, this is my data. So, you know, for me, that's what public design is at its best. Okay. Another example, Tony and myself worked on the Ukraine assistance centres as part of the Homes for Ukraine project. So in the early few weeks of the war, Tony and myself went out to the different assistance centres that were set up across Northern Ireland to understand the experience of Ukrainian refugees arriving in Northern Ireland and trying to access what is an essential service for them. Michael talked about getting out there and doing user research and observation. This is the best example that we have of that. Two insights from those visits really stayed with me. In one centre Tony walked into, which was in Ballymena, he was instantly hit when he walked in the door of the smell of stew that they were cooking in the centre. So homely, so inviting. Tony brought that insight back. All the assistance centres were preparing hot food for the visitors the following week. Okay? But if Tony hadn't visited the centre, that would never have happened. Okay? The second one was in a two-storied assistance centre. I was observing refugees coming in and signing at the reception desk. However, on the first floor, looking down on them, were Border Force officers in Border Force uniforms with guns on their belt. And I was watching people coming in the door, and I could almost see them shriveling up and taking backward steps as soon as they seen that. So I was able to give that feedback to say, you know, that is making people feel unwelcome. It's making people feel anxious. And what happened was the Border Force officers were moved to the back of the assistance centres. And for the first time ever in Northern Ireland, they were allowed to come in without their uniform on. And that all happened as part of us doing that user research, which was, you know, small. These are small things, but they make massive differences. And that's where doing user research really, really is impactful. This is actually the leaflet that we designed as part of the process, where how people will flow around the system. The play area was set up from the visits as well, because we noticed that children were running about and they were causing distractions, etc., etc. So we set up a supervised play area. These were translated into Ukrainian and Russian, and they were given to everybody when they came into the centre. Okay. Another example of public sector design, probably not the type of design you guys are working on, because it's totally non-digital. It's actually analog, but it's just as important. Okay. Going to leave you with this. I'll just finish with this wee story. So earlier this year, I attended an event in Dublin where the Irish government launched its new design for public value guidelines. They're a great document if you want to search them and read them. And it talked about the process, the progress they've made after 4 years from the launch of their design principles. There was a speech given by one of the ministers, and he used a phrase that immediately resonated with me. He described designers as the contrarian in the room who challenges systems that don't always work for people. And that felt very familiar to me. Throughout my career, as you've seen in the Northern Ireland Civil Service, I've always seen myself first and foremost as a public servant. To me, the clue's in the name. Our job simply isn't to operate a system. Our job is to serve people and to create value for society. Sometimes that means asking uncomfortable questions, challenging assumption, highlighting experiences that others may not see, and being the voice in the room that asks, is this really working for the people who need it most? After the event, I was pointed towards a quote from George Bernard Shaw that's now one of my favourite quotes, and it's, "The reasonable person adapts themselves to the world. The unreasonable one persists in trying to adapt the world to themselves. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable person." As designers, I think that's our challenge, to be constructively unreasonable, to keep questioning, to keep challenging, to keep bringing evidence, empathy and curiosity into systems that can sometimes become disconnected from the people they're there to serve. This work isn't easy. Progress is rarely linear. But if there's one thing I'd encourage you all to take away from this event this evening, it's believe in yourself, believe in your methods, trust the evidence, and never underestimate the difference one persistent designer can make. Thank you. Any questions? Ruth?
Thank you, that was really good. So I'm just curious, I just want to know, have you had at any point have you had to collaborate with third-party agencies or companies, and what are the challenges in that?
So probably all the time is the answer to that. So going back to the Ukraine work that we did, we were working with third sector organisations like Bernardo's. We are working with the Housing Executive, lots of different organisations. I think the biggest challenge there actually isn't a design challenge. It's working in a multidisciplinary team and keeping it on path. So it probably is where a project manager is important in that role and working closely with them. Again, it's the language thing. You know, there is an education piece where you maybe need to sit with people and have one-to-one conversations to help them understand why you're saying what you're saying and how you're saying it, and understanding where they're coming from and what they're raising to try and turn it into our language so that we can find the right insight to identify the right problem and then solve it.
Thank you.
Michael? Sorry, Michal.
The most interesting thing, I think, for me was the question, or the statement around that we don't have in Northern Ireland an equivalent of GDS. It highlights, like bullet points, very brief. Why don't we, and more importantly, what do we need to do to create that?
So we do have a digital team that develops services. So like GDS, what we don't have is the design principles and the service standard. Some, you know, they tend to try and maybe use some of them to guide their way. Some of the staff working in there are excellent. They're, you know, I was talking to Dima about this. They're actually members of this group who are leading some of those conversations in there, and have faced all the challenges that we have pointed out as part of our community. But I think this goes back to the point about getting a senior advocate, Michal. For me, unless there's senior advocates in the room that can prioritise design and understand the public value that design brings to the conversation, they won't invest in this method. There are so many things that I could talk about reasons why.